right, good evening. Thanks for everyone for coming on out. We, of course, had a start and a stop and a start and a stop to get us back to here, but I think we're done with taking any kind of break, so we should be able to just keep on cruising through the rest of the book going forward here, unless there's something I don't know about or the Lord has different plans. But let's open in prayer. Father God, we want to thank you for the opportunity to gather in your name, to let your word be something that we can put our hearts and minds into, Lord, so that your Holy Spirit would guide us, lead us, teach us in your word, that even areas in the Old Testament, Lord God, which so many people today want to just ignore, Lord, I know there's richness in your word, there's truth in your word, there's history, and there is edification, Lord, that can come. And we study various aspects of everything that you've revealed to us. We know it's your will to convey your word to us, and we thank you for the opportunity to open it and to learn from it and to let it transform our thinking and transform the way we interact in our world that you continue to allow us to live in, Lord. So we thank you for this time and opportunity. Ask you to invite your spirit here in each of our hearts and let us learn from you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, yeah, we are back, and like I said, still feels like we're in the very early sessions of the study of the book of Judges. Mostly, I would say, if I kind of jump into this little chart here, mostly because there's, I would say, 3 super well-known judges in the book of Judges, and that is going to be Deborah, for obvious reasons for her, Gideon, where there's actually more chapters, more verses written about Gideon's life and his service in the nation of Israel as a judge than anybody else. And then all the way at the bottom of the list is going to be Samson. And, you know, lots of people at least are aware of the name and some of the superpowers he seems to exhibit, as well as his, moral corruption throughout most of his life. So anyway, we'll get to him many, many chapters later, but, come on in. And so I figured I would review this each time just so we get a sense of the flow of the book. So in that sort of middle column there, we're looking at each judge as they are presented to us in this in the book of Judges. And I'll remind you as we do, of course, we've, like I said, had some starts and stops and whatnot. Believe that the book of Judges was written by an author in the period of the kings, so after Saul and or David, or certainly no later than Solomon. But one of the judges, or somebody in the period of the kings wrote back and said, here's how we got from Moses and Joshua to the period of the kings, and here's all the judges and everything that they've done. So whoever wrote it already had a full historical view of everything that he is writing and communicating to us. So again, we had Othniel as the very first judge presented to us, a couple of verses there in chapter 3. Ehud also in chapter 3, a little bit more, a couple verses though still. Shamgar, just one verse written about him. And then, of course, Deborah, we have her presented to us in chapters 4 and 5. And now, we kind of got started last time, 2 weeks ago, with the setup for Gideon being called into service as a judge. And that was because of Midianite oppression. And we talked about that last time, that Midian was one of the other sons of Abraham through his wife Keturah, much later after Sarah died. And so they're near of kin, at least going back into Abraham's day. But obviously, by this time, they don't, respect one another's heritage and the fact that they were somewhat close in kinship. And so they put Israel under bondage, and I think it was 7 or 8 years now. I can't remember as I don't have it in front of me, that they were in bondage. And so now Gideon, we're going to see tonight, is going to get called up into service here in chapter 6. And his service will be recorded in chapter 6, 7, and 8, giving him quite a bit of coverage in terms of his judging of Israel, both the positives and some of the negatives as well. But, generally speaking, he's a judge who is serving well. So, all right, in your notes and on the screen here, let's turn to the book of Judges. We'll look at judge number 5, Gideon, and he is first introduced to us now in chapter 6, starting in verse 11. Give everybody a chance to get there in your own scriptures for a second. All right, so Judges chapter 6, verse 11. Now the angel of Yahweh came and sat under the terebinth tree, which is at Ophrah, which belongs to Joash the I knew I was going to say this one wrong, Abiezrite, while his son Gideon, so take note there, his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, Yahweh is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if Yahweh is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not Yahweh bring us up from Egypt? But now Yahweh has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Then Yahweh turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? So he said to him, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And Yahweh said to him, surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. Then he said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, show me a sign that it is you who talk with me. Do not depart from here, I pray, until I come to you and bring out my offering and set it before you. And he said, I will wait until you come back. So Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from the ephah of flour, the meat he had put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and he brought them out to him under the terebinth tree and presented them. Then the angel of Yahweh, or angel of God, said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread and lay them on this rock and pour out the broth, and he did so. Then the angel of Yahweh put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And the angel of Yahweh departed out of his sight. Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of Yahweh. So Gideon said, alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of Yahweh face to face. Then Yahweh said to him, peace be with you. Do not fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to Yahweh and called it Yahweh is peace to this day, still in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Now it came to pass in that same night that Yahweh said to him, take your father's young bull and the second bull of 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the wooden image that is beside it. And build an altar to Yahweh your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement. And take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image that which you shall cut down. So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as Yahweh had said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. All right. So as we're seeing the commission of Gideon here, and we're going to talk about both his calling and his reticence to face his enemies. But anyway, we'll walk through kind of the various aspects of what we just read. So, of course, we're going to continue to say the angel of Yahweh is obviously the main focus and character here that is talking with Gideon. And he really has made his first appearance since the time of Joshua. So back in Judges 2:4, there's a reference to him having this conversation, the angel of Yahweh having a conversation with Joshua at the end of his life. And so if we consider all of these different decades that Israel has been under bondage, and then they had a judge come and deliver them, and they went back into bondage, and all of that cycle and that sequence and the downward spiral that we've talked about a couple of times already. This is the first time the angel of Yahweh has come back and commissioned and appointed one of the judges since Joshua. So I think that's kind of significant in the sense of, yeah, God was willing and able to deliver Israel, but there wasn't this direct communication, sending the angel, sending Jesus Christ, if we haven't already talked about that. Jesus Christ, who is the angel of Yahweh, to come and have this conversation with one of his servants, in this case the judge named Gideon. All right, so the first thing we see is the angel here, the angel of Yahweh, or maybe we should call him Jesus, but that's, the scripture isn't calling him that. In the Old Testament, the angel of Yahweh, Jesus, sits under the terebinth tree in Ophrah where Gideon was working. So he's working. Yes, sir. Yeah, it's a common form of tree. Abraham spent time under one of the terebinth trees in Israel, and Deborah had a tree that she was under, and so I don't know that you can make a case that it's the same tree, but it's certainly the same variety of tree that is good for shade, and people were using for that. So, good question. So in this case, this is the territory that was assigned to Manasseh, a little bit up north of where we typically think of Jerusalem and where Judah had their region towards the south. And specifically, this tree and this conversation is taking place in the territory of Joash, who is Gideon's father. Now, we don't know the significance. He will show up here in the next sequence. But we don't know his relationship. We know from the text here that he had an altar of Baal on his property and, all that was going on there. But we don't really know anything much else about him, and other than his heritage is obviously from Manasseh, and his son, who becomes famous, is Gideon. Now, Gideon was hiding in a wine press so that he could thresh wheat out of sight of the Midianites, who would surely have tried to thwart his life-saving work to feed his family. Now, we looked a little bit about the oppression of the Midianites last time. We didn't get a chance to cover that tonight or bring it in, but they were quite oppressive. And there seems to be a couple of things that we can glean from his choice of threshing wheat in the winepress. So his choice indicates a level of oppression in Israel as they were under this brutality that prevented them from threshing life-sustaining wheat. So to me, I read that and sort of surmise that it's likely the Midianites not only wanted to kill the Israelites, but they intended to see them suffer while they died. Right? There's a difference between let's pick up a sword and let's, do what we do, and another thing in saying, we're going to go burn their crops, but let them try to survive without the crops. And so here's Gideon, knowing that these Midianites are like waiting and watching for them to die of starvation or other kinds of necessities that they might need in life. And so they're to my mind, they're being painted as a very cruel oppressor over them, not just making them slave labor like Pharaoh in Egypt, but literally doing everything they can to even thwart the basics of life, including feeding oneself. And so Gideon knows that they are these harsh oppressors, and he's going out at night, no street lights, no electricity, right? Going out at night, maybe maybe this is not a moonlit night. He's going out at night, and he is in a wine press, hiding and threshing this wheat, because he knows that the Midianites, if they see him, will probably do everything they can to prevent him or just kill him so that he can't thresh the wheat and then provide bread for his family. He's got something going on where he is absolutely convinced this is the only way to accomplish a very, very life-sustaining kind of task. Yeah. All right, so since a wine press is a small structure by comparison to where you would normally thresh wheat out there in an open area, most of you probably know, but I'll go ahead and say, kind of the way we understand it. I've never done it, but my way you understand is you take the grains of wheat and you're going to, throw them up into the wind on a threshing floor. Your heavy grain is going to fall, and the chaff that gets, carried off by the wind, it blows downwind somewhere so that you have this nice spot at the bottom. And you would obviously be doing this with implements, a pitchfork or whatever that you lift up in the air, and you're throwing big chunks of, grain into the air, and you're trying to get as much of the chaff to blow away as you possibly can. A wine press is not conducive to that kind of function. It's very small, and you're just going to get a little bit done, and he's probably just trying to get enough for a day or a couple of days worth at a time. He's not doing the whole harvest that you would do to kind of store up grain for the season. And so here's kind of a picture of a couple of wine presses that I found in my Bible software. So you can see, there's one where you might have a couple of guys, in a little, that's one's a wine press, the other, but anyway, so you've got a couple of guys maybe, stomping out grapes, and there's a little bit of a space, and there might be some coverage there or whatever. On the lower right for you, just a little tiny little wine press type thing, maybe barely enough to kind of stand in. So which one, what kind of, what's the size of Gideon's wine press? I don't know, but obviously it's not this great big open structure that you would typically see, like let's say Boaz when he's threshing wheat when Ruth shows up and all that. Okay. So Gideon was likely in a state of crisis, I'm thinking, because as he's working to survive, both himself and his family, in the middle of these very oppressive conditions. I think that's the word picture that's presented to us here in chapter 6, is Gideon is, very much in a survival mode and recognizing that his oppressors are these cruel, sort of murderous types who really want to watch them suffer more than they want to do anything else. All right. Now, having painted that picture of what the Midianite oppression looked like under Gideon's time, the angel of Yahweh appears on the scene, and he seems to take what I'll call little notice. Not that he doesn't know what Gideon's doing, not that he doesn't understand the situation, but he takes very little notice of the fact that, hey, Gideon, you're standing in a wine press. Why don't you do that during the day when there's, in a proper area for that kind of work? And he's certainly not taking zero notice of the fact that he's probably greatly afraid that the Midianites will see him and come and abuse him or kill him or whatever the outcome he might fear is. So instead of taking notice of, what Gideon might be wanting him to take notice of, or somebody to take notice of in support of him, saying, oh, you're living a very hard life. This is very challenging for you. You're trying to feed yourself or your family. Instead, the angel of Yahweh declares that Gideon is, or maybe I think will be, a mighty man of valor. Of course, that word valor in the Hebrew means strength or power, can mean wealth, meaning a person of prominence and position and power, and here he is at night threshing wheat in a wine press. It's hard to get much lower than that in terms of status. And yet the angel has a different vision of him. He's kind of speaking actual truth over the life that Gideon will live and the judging that he will perform, not taking notice of his current circumstances. So at this moment, Gideon was not aware, so don't in our minds as we're interpreting this, Gideon is not aware of who he's talking to. I believe he probably understands he's talking to a spiritual being, an angel, but he certainly doesn't know that he's talking directly to Yahweh, directly to God, as he starts the conversation. So he does acknowledge that the figure is a dignitary of some kind, and by calling him in the Hebrew, Adonai, which means Lord but not Yahweh. Right? There's two main words in Hebrew you would use for Lord as it's translated in most English translations. That's why I separate the two, because Adonai can mean master or Lord or something like that. Like anybody who's in charge of anything can be called an Adonai. But Yahweh is Yahweh, and it's exclusive to him. So Gideon here is not calling him the angel of Yahweh. He's not calling him God. He's not calling him Yahweh. He calls him Adonai. He calls him Lord or Master, and he's still evaluating, well, who is this person that's speaking with me at this moment? So then Gideon asked the figure, if Yahweh was on Israel's side, like if God is for Israel, then why is Israel suffering the oppression and they're literally so close to starvation, right? He wouldn't be out there in that wine press if he has a nice cellar of grain somewhere that he can go and make some wafer cakes or whatever to feed himself, feed his family. I don't know who's all involved. but he's obviously close to starvation in the work that he's chosen to do here in the middle of the night. And so he's asking this messenger, this personage who's standing with him, if God is with us, why are we suffering? Why are we basically ready to die of starvation? And then goes on further to ask why his generation is not seeing the types of miracles that prior generations witnessed under Moses and Joshua. And he's clearly not taking notice that his own father has an altar to Baal in his own backyard, right? Or front yard, or wherever it may be. And so he's asking, well, why isn't Yahweh on our side? And his own dad, and I don't know what we're never told what Gideon thinks about this altar of Baal, but he's like, we want Yahweh to bless us, and my father worships Baal, and that's probably a very common occurrence for Israel in Gideon's day at this time. So, but he's also asking, why are we seeing these miracles? Well, you would see the work in the hand of the Lord and his blessing and his mercy and how he cares for his people if you weren't being a harlot playing the harlot with these other idols and false gods and everything else that the nation is experiencing. So why? Well, he should be answering his own question, but he's going to go ahead and ask the messenger what the issue is. So in Gideon's view, at this time, and you can hopefully understand a little bit of his mindset. Like, here he is, he's thinking, oh, we're so oppressed. Oh, no one loves us. Oh, we're so abused by both physical and spiritual forces against us. And he's like, why are we really that bad a people? And so, he's wrestling with that. And so in his view, Yahweh has forsaken them. And in some respects, he's right. Yahweh has forsaken them because they forsook Yahweh. And they are being punished for their disobedience. Now in verse 6:14, I think the narrator, not the angel and not Gideon, but the narrator directly equates the angel of Yahweh with God, with Yahweh himself, as indicated by this description. Then Yahweh turned to him and said, this is not, the angel that Yahweh sent turned to him and said, this is another direct confirmation that you have to be dealing with the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit is the one who is identified as Yahweh, who turns and has a conversation directly with Gideon at that moment. And as I indicate, in the New Testament, we hear phrases like, no one has seen God at any time. Okay, well, we're thinking of that as the Father. And we also think of Jesus talking about the Holy Spirit being like the wind. It blows from a direction and it blows past you, but you can't really see the wind, just like you can't really see the Spirit. If those are sort of eternal descriptions of the Father and the Holy Spirit, then we have one choice who mankind has absolutely been able to put their eyes on. He wrestled with Jacob in the Old Testament. Abraham made him loaves of bread and had dinner with him, had a conversation with him, and of course Jesus comes. And so we call those, of course, pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus Christ. You can call them theophanies, theo meaning God, or theos meaning God, or you can call them Christophanies or Christophanies because it's obviously Jesus Christ. So I would hold to that Christophany view that we are dealing with a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ who's having a conversation with Gideon. Okay. If you have a different view, you're welcome to have that, but that's how I would interpret the text and the meaning. Yes, sir. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think you can do a word study on the angel of the Lord, all capital in your New King James. I pronounce that angel of Yahweh because that's what it really is, the tetragrammaton, the YHWH. And I think if you did a concordant search or an online search on a computer and said, show me every reference to the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, in the Old Testament, you would see very clear references like this, where it's clearly God speaking in the first person as God, And the other cases where it may not be as clear, I believe there's no specific way you would discredit the idea that the angel of the Lord is anything but Jesus Christ. You wouldn't say, oh, well, I mean, sometimes he refers to himself in the third person, and certainly he refers to the Father in heaven as God at times, but he never discounts himself as being divine, and there's nothing that would ever indicate that he is anything other than the second person of the Trinity. Okay, so that's my interpretation. That's how my study has revealed for me. But great question also. All right, so here the angel of Yahweh, or Yahweh himself, or Jesus himself, instructs Gideon to go forth, that he might go forth in might, for he would then be used, Gideon would be used to save Israel from their oppressors, the Midianites. Now, this victory is not, by the strength or the training or the other skills that Gideon has. The deliverance from the hands of the Midianites would come by God's power alone. Okay, that's the main picture that is being communicated here, that God will bring this deliverance. In fact, at one point he says, I'm going to bring us as by one man. Now we're going to see later that it's actually 300 men, but also in effect, it's almost like it's by no man, as we're going to see. The battle is basically hands off for Gideon and his 300 men. The Lord takes care of the victory for them. We'll see that here in a little bit. Okay, so in a mix of what I see is humility and fear and self-doubt, all of those sort of come into play here. Gideon inquired of Yahweh concerning how Gideon, could be the one to save Israel, and then he gives this list of reasons why he's not a good choice, or he can't imagine how he would be successful in this. So he says, first off, well, Manasseh is the weakest of all the tribes, and Gideon is considered the least in his father's house. Now, to me, it's not clear if these are factual statements, or again, statements about humility and or fear overriding him, but at least it is in part a description of the perception that Yahweh elected Gideon to that task. He didn't pick the strong warrior type. He didn't pick the David, who goes out there and slays the giant. He's picking Gideon, the man hiding in the wine press and at night and trying to feed his family without anybody taking notice so he doesn't die. And so he's picking the most unlikely candidate for a reason. God often picks the most unlikely candidate for a reason so that God can show the full measure of his strength and his power and his glory, and no man can take credit for what Yahweh alone does. And so it's a good choice. Whether or not Gideon's statement is factually true, that their tribe is the least of all the tribes, and Gideon is absolutely the least in his house, and therefore he's like the smallest, most insignificant figure in all of Israel, don't know, but probably not true, at least in terms of maybe it is true in terms of all who are of age to go to battle or war. But, there's obviously going to be older men who are frail and they're not ready to go to battle and all that kind of stuff. But Gideon is certainly putting himself low on the lowest rung of why anybody would pick him. But the angel of Yahweh, Christ, then assured Gideon that he would be with him. Yahweh plus Gideon was all that was necessary to bring about this victory. And really, it's Yahweh plus no one, but Yahweh is including Gideon in the conversation and in the action that he's going to perform. So Gideon now recognized the possibility, so it's at that moment when he's having this conversation and that little description where he says, I will be with you and I will bring the victory, that Gideon realizes the possibility that he's actually communicating with God himself, who goes in the Old Testament by the name Yahweh and the New Testament. But he nevertheless requested a sign that it was to demonstrate this actually is Yahweh. Now, this is always a little bit of a tricky thing. If you read both Old and New Testament, sometimes people get away with it, and sometimes they get judged fairly harshly for not believing. And you can just guess that that's God who knows the heart, knows the reason why the person is asking, and it's not really the sinful reason for asking the question. But other times somebody asks for a sign or a miracle or, or some kind of evidence that it's going to take place, and, Zechariah becomes mute, or whatever. And so you have these sort of punishments for asking the question. Gideon doesn't seem to fall into that category. Gideon asks for a sign, and this angel of the Lord is willing to give it to him. Now, in part, I think that might be so because they've had decades longs of no miracles and decades long of, we haven't seen a lot of evidence that Yahweh is on our side. And how do and of course, hardly anybody has any experience with actually worshiping God, Yahweh, the way it's been instructed to. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this altar of Baal, whatever, in your backyard. So I think that all that might play into the fact that this young man, I'm assuming he's fairly young. I don't know if he's in his teens or 20s or 30s, but I assume he's fairly young. He hasn't really seen what it looks like to worship God or know how God works. He's only heard accounts, and those accounts are so far and so distant from his knowledge and experience, he doesn't know who he's kind of operating with. So I think he gets a pass where other people might not. Okay, Gideon did not wait for Yahweh to provide a sign, but instead requested. So he didn't say, in other words, I want to know that it's you. Can you show me a sign? That's not what he does. He says, I want to know that it's really you. Can I go get a sacrifice and bring it to you, and we'll watch what happens from there? Okay, so he then requests, can you stay here? Now I'll go home. I'll get the sacrifices that I believe are appropriate, and I'll bring them back to you. So he requests this angel, Yahweh, Christ, wait for him, and the angel agrees and waits for him to go home and get the sacrifice, which I assume was fairly quickly prepared. It was unleavened bread, and he does bring in the meat, and he brings in the unleavened bread. Let's assume it didn't take him all that long. In fact, everything that we're going to talk about here is happening in the middle of the night. And so it's still nighttime, still just a couple of hours. So at most, maybe it took him an hour or something, I would guess, to go and get this sacrifice so he can continue his conversation with the angel of God. So Gideon goes and he prepares the young goat, which, again, I don't think it takes very long to do that, to go grab a goat from your pen and bring it out. And then the unleavened bread. But I will say that I would speculate that both the animal livestock and the bread supplies were in fairly short supply. Otherwise, why is Gideon in the winepress threshing the wheat in the middle of the night? And so I think they're probably not totally destitute of it, but for him to bring this out as a sacrifice is really a sacrifice in the truest sense of the word, right? It is something that his family needs for survival, and he's going to bring it to this angel, to angel of Yahweh, as a costly sacrifice that he's going to make. Yeah. Yeah, it depends on how close they were. Yeah, we don't know exactly how far close they were, but he's going to grab the goat and it's going to do the bleeding thing, and they're going to take care of it. But nevertheless, he's doing it in the middle of the night, and my point is, of course, that it really is costly. It's like giving the Lord a very expensive and life-sustaining offering. Okay, so once the sacrifice is prepared, again, I don't know how long it took, but it's still in the middle of the night, and he goes and gets it, and he brings the sacrifices back to the terebinth tree and presents them to the angel of Yahweh. So then the angel of Yahweh instructs Gideon to place the sacrificial elements on a specific rock. Now, usually when God is talking in the Old Testament about building sacrifices and whatnot, these are usually stones or rocks that are never cut with a human hand, right? It's God, put the rock there, but man didn't carve it and turn it into something, because then that starts to get into idolatry and all that. So anyway, the angel says, take this rock and lay your goat on top of the rock, and your bread or your grain, the unleavened bread on top of the rock, and then pour out the broth on top of it. And that kind of reminds me of Elijah, pouring stuff on his sacrifice so that it would be like an extra handicap. If this thing is going to get consumed by fire, it's already drenched in wet. So the angel is the one who's instructing this. Lay it all out there, pour the broth on top of it, and then watch what I do in terms of bringing fire to consume the sacrifice. Which is what he does. So the angel of the Lord then apparently has a staff in his hands. First time we've taken a note of that. The angel has a staff in his hand, and he touches the tip of the staff upon the sacrifice. And when it touched the rock, fire came out of the rock, seemingly, and consumed the meat and the bread, which is obviously a miracle here, right? So he's demonstrating, and this reminds me of things like Abel's sacrifice was accepted, and Cain's sacrifice in chapter 4 of Genesis was rejected. And you go, how did they know? Well, here's an example of God accepting a sacrifice that was very visible and tangible for Gideon to take notice of. Could be something similar to what Abel experienced and Cain did not back in Genesis chapter 4. So when fire came out, consumes it all. Obviously this is a miracle. Obviously this is a demonstration that the sacrifice that Gideon was making was acceptable to God. So with this undeniable sign of the power and the presence of Yahweh, the angel of Yahweh, Jesus, departs out of Gideon's sight, at least for a moment. And it was then Gideon fully accepted. He was already suspicious or already speculating, I think this might be God. This might be Yahweh. This might be the angel of Yahweh. Now he's really fully on board. He's fully accepted that the figure really was God himself that he was having a conversation with. And so Gideon then turns in his mind or whatever, maybe he speaks out loud. He marvels that he was able to have this face-to-face conversation with God himself, with Yahweh, and live. Of course, we're talking here about the second person of the Trinity, which is not like the one who Moses walked by Moses in the cleft of the rock. This is a manifestation of God in a form that he can have a conversation with man directly like that. But Gideon is obviously floored, to use that term, that he actually lived through the experience. Now, this would only be possible if the angel was Jesus, and we're giving you that description, right? Who also at other times has come down from heaven to speak with men or have interactions with men like Abraham, like Jacob, like Moses, and other places where it is possible. And in all of those cases, to me, my theology would say those are Christophanies, those are pre-incarnate appearances of Jesus Christ. So, yeah. That's a good question. He does seem surprised that he made it. No, I can't think of any examples where like the angel of the Lord came in a positive way and had a conversation with one of these servants or messengers or something like that. Now, I mean, there certainly can be, the angel of the Lord, if I'm thinking correctly at the moment, it was the angel that the Lord sent, for in Egypt when the death of the firstborn, the 10th plague came. And I think some people might view that as Christ in that sense. But that might be a little less precise as to who the death angel who passed through the camp of Egypt was at that time. So, but in any of these kind of like I said, with Jacob and Abraham and Moses and others, and now Gideon, no, we don't have any example that they were so sinful that he just judged them on the spot. There's obviously a reason why he showed up and had a conversation with them to move them forward in their whatever he had purposed for them. Yeah, well, I mean, he understands probably from that Moses understood that if you see me face to face, you'll die. And so there's a sense that it's really a very dangerous and frightening thing to see God face to face. Yeah, the angel of the Lord. Yeah, and he walked with a hip problem, a limp, and the rest of his life. So, Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, but no, I don't think so. Tim? No, not no, no, no. Right. So yeah, they wouldn't understand that the distinct personages of the Godhead, and so he wouldn't understand how he could have a conversation in that theological sense. Yeah, yeah. I would not expect that. So okay, all good questions and challenges. Um, so while the angel of Yahweh had departed, so he departs from this conversation after having consumed the sacrifice. He nevertheless turns and still speaks comforting words to Gideon from somewhere beyond his sight, it seems, I guess. Can't really picture the event, but it's in the dark, so he might be just a couple of footsteps away. I don't know. But he says to Gideon, having departed from the presence, "Peace be with you. Do not fear. You shall not die." So he understands Gideon's fear of him, but also recognition that he's going to send him to battle with the Midianites. And hey, guess what, Gideon? The angel of Yahweh, who's just proven himself to be God, has told you, you will not die doing the work that I have appointed for you to do. So pretty awesome stuff. So Gideon next followed in his ancestors' footsteps by building an altar to Yahweh at the very place where he had this personal encounter. Again, Noah did that. Abraham did that, Isaac did that, Jacob did that, right? We have lots of these examples where there's this personal encounter with the angel of Yahweh or Yahweh himself, and what does the person do in response? They build an altar and to memorialize and to maybe make additional sacrifices for the fact that they have had this incredible life-changing encounter with the divine creator and savior of the world. And so in doing so, in building this altar, he's naming the place where he builds the altar, the Lord is peace, or Yahweh is peace, which remain in Ophrah of the Abizarites at the time the book of Judges was written, as I said earlier tonight, written in the times of the kings, so Saul or David or something like that. Now all of these, as I already mentioned though, events took place in one single night. So he'd already been out there for who knows how long, threshing wheat and all that after the sun went down. And then he has this big conversation with Yahweh. Then he goes and gets the sacrifice. He lays out the sacrifice, and all that takes place. And so all of this is happening in those, 8-10 hours, maybe, who knows, at nighttime at most. Okay. And so all they're taking place at night, and then Yahweh gave Gideon additional instructions. Again, he seems to have departed from his presence, but he's also giving him further instructions, and he tells him this: take your father's young bull, the second that was 7 years old. So take this very specific bull. Don't know how many others they had or whatever it was, but you take this very specific bull, and then you, Gideon, in the middle of the night, go tear down the altar of Baal that your father built, and cut down the wooden carved image, this idol of Baal that was beside it. This is a strong statement, like if Yahweh is going to deliver Israel, then Israel has to do its part to get rid of the pagan idolatry, the pagan worship that was taking place in their land. And Gideon's own home, or his own dad's house, was the place to start. And so tear down the altar that was built up for Baal, and then take the image of Baal himself, and he's going to be used for a specific purpose. So then build a proper altar, as I've said, which is like an uncut, unhewn stone, using the rock where the sacrifice that he'd already brought to the angel of God out, and then where that fire consumed the sacrifice. So then this bull was to be offered as a sacrifice on Yahweh's altar, and the wooden image, the false carved idol of Baal, was going to be used for fuel for the fire. If that's not an insult, I don't know what is, right? You were bowing down and worshiping this carved wooden image, and the next thing you know, it's just being burned up for a sacrifice to the true God. And I think there's obvious reasons why this was the instruction given to Gideon. So Gideon then took 10 of his family's servants and did all that Yahweh commanded him. So he's ready to go and do what God has commanded him to do with the bull and the altar and Baal and all of that. But as you can tell, Gideon was still motivated by fear, even though he's been given these very strong promises that God would be with him and that he would not die. So he still does all this work at night, right? So he's going to tear down the altar of Baal. He's going to build up the proper altar to Yahweh. He's going to cut down or grab the image of Baal and burn it to make it a sacrifice for the bull that he's going to burn. He did all this work because he feared his own, the men of the city, more than he was trusting in Yahweh to protect him while he was following the commands and obedience to what he was instructed to do. So he was obedient, but there's also a strong sense of he's still fearing the conditions that he's living under. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll see that here in a moment. I think that's true. He's going to be very much in defense of his son's actions in the very next section that we read. But he also allowed an altar of Baal on his property, and so he may have been like turned on a dime, as we might call it. He went from, we worship Baal to, my son Gideon has had an encounter with Yahweh. Let's worship Yahweh and get rid of Baal. Okay. So yeah, he still seems to me in the text to be motivated by fear of the conditions that he is living under, and so he's obedient, but he's not making a big brash showing of it at first. Okay. It'll be exposed very soon, though. So with that, let's turn to Gideon now facing his own battle and his father helping him a little bit with those in his own community who are worshiping Baal after he tears down that altar. So chapter 6, starting in verse 28, going through verse 35, a little bit shorter section here. So after all that we just looked at, and when the men of the city arose early in the morning, there was the altar of Baal torn down, and the wooden image that was beside it cut down, and the second bull was being offered. So this is all happening now in the morning, early morning hours, offered on the altar which had been built. So they said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" And when they had inquired and asked, they said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing." Then the men of the city said to Joash, "Bring out your son that he may die, because he has torn down the altar of Baal and because he has cut down the wooden image that was beside it." But Joash said to all who stood against him, "Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down." Therefore on that day he, the father, called him Jerubbaal, saying, "Let Baal plead against him, and because he has torn down his altar." So he's calling his son Gideon Jerubbaal, or Jerubbaal. Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of Yahweh came upon Gideon, and he blew the trumpet, and the Abiezrites gathered behind him. Then he sent messengers throughout all of Manasseh, who gathered behind him. And he also sent messengers to Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. All right, so Gideon's sort of in trouble, and then he's immediately going to fulfill his role as a judge, and of course, judge means a military commander over the armies and forces of Israel. So the men of the city, now we would assume that these are Israelites, but it's possible that the men of this city are Midianites. They may have had people in the city who were Midianites, sort of camped there to oversee the conduct of their Israelite captives. So it doesn't tell us either way who these men really were, but they're clearly deeply committed to worshiping Baal. They discovered the destroyed remains of Baal's altar and his image that is now being used as a burned sacrifice. They can still see the wood of what it was as it's burning, and the bull is still being consumed by the fire. And they also observed that the bull had been offered as a sacrifice on a newly erected altar, which obviously is a change of worshiping a deity, right? They went from the old altar, which is torn down, to a new altar, and they're saying there's a new worship in town, new altar in town, and they're worshiping, on something new, and we haven't approved it. And the men of the city are quite upset that this has taken place because they don't know what's going on. All right, and this act was an unmistakable insult to the God that they had been worshiping. Of course, lowercase g, not a real God, but the altar and the paganness of all that is an insult to the God that they had previously, for weeks or months or years or whatever, been worshiping there in that city. The men began to inquire as to who had done this, and soon discovered, I don't know, it was one of the companions or servants that Gideon had working with him in the middle of the night, or somebody else observed it but was unwilling to sort of intervene to stop Gideon from what he was doing. But somebody, of course, rumors and gossip, and everybody knows something, and it doesn't take long before they realize that Gideon is in fact the culprit for the thing that they are upset by. So then the men demanded that Joash, the father of Gideon, bring Gideon out so they could put him to death. Like this is a capital offense in their estimation. However, and as we just noted leading into the section, Joash contended with the men in defense of his own son by further embarrassing the men who were wanting to kill his son for worshiping a powerless and voiceless God who could not defend himself against a man tearing down his altar and using his image to be burned. Okay. Now, it's not clear if Joash was only protecting his son, like, I don't want my son to die, or if he had this instantaneous conversion from formerly worshiping Baal on his own property, or what the situation really was here. But it may be that he saw and understood that his son had a true encounter with Yahweh, and it did turn him very much instantaneously to rejecting what he formerly practiced and moving into proper worship of God, Yahweh himself. So specifically, Joash challenged the men to consider that if Baal was actually a god, then he should have been strong enough to stop Gideon from destroying his altar and his image. Now, for a moment, you could say, well, is the wooden image actually Baal, or is it is it just a representation of Baal? Of course, Yahweh in the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, and in the second commandment, you shall make no graven image, right? And so Yahweh forbid all that, but of course Baal is fine with this, but so if you're bowing down to this wooden altar, is there any power in the wood, in the image itself, or are you trying to worship something you think is spiritually behind it? Those are all sort of questions that you may ask for somebody in those areas. We can't answer them because God forbids bowing down and worshiping any kind of graven image. Further, Joash contended, though, but if Baal was a god, then surely he can speak for himself rather than needing these men of the city to come and defend him when he's being voiceless. Now, these are all, Joash's logic worked in the moment when he is refuting his, objectors, or the ones who want to kill his son. But Yahweh is God, right? Let's not use this as a principle for God himself, because Yahweh is a God, and over history, Yahweh has allowed sinful men to tear down the altars that were built up for him. And he's very often, in fact, uses men to speak for him. He used Moses to write the first 5 books of the Bible. He uses David to write the 150, some 100 and some odd Psalms. He uses men as his voice. He often uses prophets to speak for him. So Joash's logic seems sound in the moment, but I would appeal to all of us not to use that to say, well, if God were God, then he wouldn't let anybody defile his altar or tear down his sacrifices. Or, like I'm thinking of Antiochus Epiphanes in 165-ish BC, who brings a pig into the altar and sacrifices it, or later on in 2 Thessalonians 2, the Antichrist will stand up and declare himself to be God to the world. And, you think, well, if God is God, why doesn't he stop that? Well, he has a purpose in not stopping those things. But the reality is, Baal isn't anything. It has no power. Now, Satan has power, and Satan can do certain things that you and I know to be spiritually impossible for men to do. But, his logic is humanly sound for the moment. Just don't read Scripture and think, well, if God was God, he wouldn't let this thing happen. Or if God was God, he could speak for himself. And no, God uses men to speak for him on many, many occasions, and most occasions, actually. And he has allowed sinful men, because of sinful Israel, he's allowed things like Titus Vespasian to destroy the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. So it's not a correlation. It's not something you should mark as saying, oh, Joash is so good here. Anyway, not to belabor the point. Okay. Therefore, Joash's challenge should not be considered as an appropriate way of evaluating Yahweh's divine character or in evaluating the reality of his existence. That's my point. But nevertheless, the logic seemed reasonable to the men of the city, who then assigned a new name to Gideon, and they called him Jerubbaal, meaning the one who contended with Baal. Okay. And this new name is frequently substituted for Gideon's name throughout the rest of the several chapters that are dedicated to his name. Sometimes he's called Gideon, sometimes he's called Jerubbaal, and sometimes he's called Jerubbaal, and in parentheses, the narrator says Gideon. But over the next couple of, next week or so, I guess, we will look at occasions where he's simply called Jerubbaal, and you have to remember, oh yeah, he got a name change on the night that he was commissioned into service. And so, yeah. It says they gave him the new name, and so I believe it's the men of the city who gave him the name. Yeah. The one. So they seem to have jumped on board. If I can sort of paint that picture the way I see it, you may see it differently. That's okay. The way I see it, here was Joash was a Baal worshiping man, perfectly content. And he realizes his son has torn down the altar to Baal and set up an altar to Yahweh, and he immediately says, well, then we're worshiping Yahweh going forward. And the men of the city come to kill Gideon for doing these acts that he's done, and he gives them this, or Joash sort of gives them, hey, well, Baal can defend himself, and he chose not to do it. Maybe he's not really God. And the men sort of immediately go, okay, well, then let's go along with Gideon and follow Gideon into what he wants to do. And it seems like it immediately, for the whole men of the city, they're ready to get on board with Gideon. I don't think his life was in danger after that conversation. Yeah, exactly. A very good parallel there. Yeah, it's not God. Yeah. A singular. Okay, so it was probably his dad, unless it was one of the men who was the chief spokesman for the crowd. But probably his dad. Yeah, I think I remember that now. Okay. Yeah, I think that's what I assumed too, but I think I put made a mistake in the notes. So I think it's his dad would be my best speculation, which is what the text seems to indicate. Okay, so the word of Gideon's actions against Baal, and by extension, the authority of the Midianites over Israel, now comes to the leaders of both the Midianites and the Amalekites. What is going on in the territory of Manasseh over there at Joash's house? And so they're like, uh-oh, we've been subjugating this nation of Israel for X number of years, and something's amiss. We better get in there and fix this problem. So it seems likely that some of the men who contended with Joash, meaning they were originally standing opposed to Gideon, were either Midianites or were loyal to the Midianites despite being Israelites. So somebody, again, like I just said earlier, word seems to always get out, right? And so somehow over there at some distance, whatever it may be, the Midianites and the Amalekites are being exposed to the fact that there's now a uprising in Israel, and the time has come to deal with the situation. So this news caused the Midianites and the Amalekites to prepare for a new military engagement with Israel as they gathered in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of Yahweh had come upon Gideon, who then blew the trumpet in his place. Now, of course, this is very common, right? You're probably very aware of this. Blowing the trumpet, depending on which type of trumpet and the type of trumpet blast, calls Israel, the military men of Israel to come to battle. So Gideon blows the trumpet, which is now calling Israel to go to battle with the Amalekites and the Amalekites. Okay. And he's beginning with his own clan, I should say, the Abizarites, his father's clan. So they're the first ones are ready to go to battle, but he's also calling Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, more, surrounding tribes, to come and go against their current oppressors, predominantly the Midianites. Okay, so let's look at the next section here, and that is a well-known moment in Gideon's life, the Gideon's fleece account. Okay, so Gideon is still sort of a little bit fearful, a little bit uncertain as to what's going to happen here. So he's got this fleece in his mind that will help him know that he's doing the Lord's will. And once again, the Lord will allow him the privilege of testing him, if you will, or confirming whether or not the Lord is on his side in all of this. So again, this is one of the main reasons why Gideon is so well known, is because of the fleece thing, the Gideon's fleece. So chapter 6, verse 36. So Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece together, he wrung out the dew of the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, but on the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. And it was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. So Gideon gets a 2-night confirmation with this fleece that God will in fact give him that victory. Again, you can pick your own decisions as to why God sometimes goes along with these sort of challenges to what he said, and sometimes he doesn't. But in this case, Gideon seems to have lots of favor with God to sort of test his way through the experiences he's living with. So while it is never advised to test or tempt God, I can give you verses. Never put the Lord to God to a test, right? Deuteronomy 6:16 and Matthew 4:7. Jesus uses that to challenge Satan. Gideon is one of the rare men who got away with seeking additional confirmation of what Yahweh had already promised him and commanded him to do. So Gideon gets away with it, and not all of us will. Yahweh did not instruct Gideon to use the fleece as a means for confirmation. This wasn't God's idea for Gideon to use this fleece, but he didn't rebuke him for making the request, and so he goes along with it and gives him the full confirmation he needs. So with warfare imminent and with the knowledge that Israel had fallen to enemy oppression years earlier, Gideon proposed this test to confirm that Yahweh would in fact save Israel by his hand. Test number 1, night number 1, dry ground but a damp fleece, which was miraculously confirmed by Yahweh. And then the second night, the second test, a dry fleece surrounded by dew-covered ground, also miraculously confirmed. Okay. Neither Yahweh nor the writer of Judges offers any commentary on Gideon's actions, why he did this, why he thought it was a good idea. But all that's revealed about Yahweh is that the requests were granted, thereby confirming the will of God to deliver his people through his judge, through his servant, Gideon. Okay, so that's the story of the fleece. And again, Gideon's fleece is a well-known idiom, even in people who don't even know that it's a Bible story. You probably hear that kind of idiom out there. Oh, Gideon, throw out a fleece. Let's find out whether or not we're going to be successful in this business endeavor we're going to do, or whatever. Right? People who don't even know Judges or Gideon or anything else will use that same idiom in our current language all the way up to this day. And so that's all that we really know about it. But he does throw the dice, if you will, test God when he's probably not advised to do so, but God answers the test and gives him every conceivable way of confirming, I will give you victory. I will spare your life. You will lead my nation back into freedom and victory. Okay, so then in chapter 7, we're going to start to see, so I'm going to flip my page here. I'm going to put the notes on there. All right, so we're going to see that in order to accomplish this victory and give God all of the glory for it, rather than Israel's army and their ability to fight against their foes, God is going to, and this is also fairly common or fairly well known in lore about Gideon, is that God is going to pare down his military force down to a very small number, at least certainly in comparison to the men they're going to go fight against. Okay. All right. So in chapter 7 of Judges, verse 1, then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Herod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. And Yahweh said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So he originally had 32,000. He ends up with 10 at the bottom end of this transaction. But Yahweh said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you. And whomever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and Yahweh said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink, and the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. Then Yahweh said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hand, and he sent them all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. All right. So Gideon's 300 men are selected. And we see how all that plays out. So Gideon, of course, is called Jerubbaal here in the section because he's sort of a military guy, and he's gaining victory, just like he had victory over Baal. Now he's going to gain victory over the Midianites. And he set up a military camp on the west side of the Jezreel Valley beside the well of Herod. An intermittent spring of water is what that well of Herod is. I think sometimes water is available from the well, sometimes it's not, probably based on the water table or springtime or whatever. Here's a picture of the valley of Jezreel. just looking out from, and this is obviously modern, you can see a highway over there on the right-hand side. And then over here is a topo map of that same area. So this side over here, here's Gilead on this side, on the east side. And of course, down over here is where Moab and their strongholds are. And here you got the Jordan River, so you got the Sea of Galilee up here, the Dead Sea down here, and you got this map. You can see this is mountainous on this side, this is mountainous on this side, but they're now camped over here in near Gilead, and that's where the staging area is going to take place. But like Gideon himself, his people would be over on this side, the region that he lives in. At times, it changes dramatically based on the spring runoffs. So when the Jordan River, like when Joshua crossed it, God parted it for them so they could cross over just like they did in the Red Sea. Other times, in like say late summer or whatever, you could wade across it without any problem, as I understand things. Okay, anyway, just to give you a visual of that area and where they're positioned. So this position, Israel's army on the south side of the Midianites, army south of the Midianites, who were on the hill over by Moriah, or Morah. The total number of men who initially came to Gideon, willing to join him to go to battle, was 32,000. But Yahweh told Gideon that number was far too many, and that would cause them to believe that they were responsible for the victory rather than God. So Gideon then just simply made an announcement to all 32,000 men. If anybody's got fear in your hearts about this battle, just go home. And so 22,000 men said, no, I don't have to go to battle today. I'll go home. And 10,000 decided, no, we're still brave. We'll go to battle. So the 22,000 took advantage. They go home to their tents, and leaving Gideon with 10,000, which is still too many for Yahweh. And so he devised another test to pare down the total number of men where they would go into battle with Gideon. So this was God's test, God's way of filtering out the men, came by way of how they would go down to the water source. I don't know if it was a particular river or stream or pond or whatever in that area, but they would go down to some water source and take a drink. So he was using that need of them to get some water for themselves to pare down the rest of the men so that he could get it to the number that God wanted on his side, to oppose all of the thousands of men on the Midianite side. So those who drank in what we're going to have to assume was a typical fashion of drinking out of, let's say, a stream or a pond, don't exactly know how, would get down on their knees and they would drink water, and I don't know what that looks like. Maybe they had a scoop or something. They would, I don't know, cup it into their hands maybe and drink it like that. Maybe the best guess that I would have. And so the number who did what you would call the traditional, get down on your knees and cup the water into your mouth, was 9,700 out of the 10,000. However, you had 300 men who scooped up water into their hands, but then drank it like a dog. They lapped it with their tongues. Now, have you ever watched a dog drink in slow motion? On slow motion video, they have a really interesting way of getting a little cup of their tongue where it brings a bunch of water into their mouth, which humans can't do. But nevertheless, and at least from Gideon's perspective, he saw, oh, you're lapping like a dog, you go stand over there. Oh, you're drinking more like a normal human being, you go stand over there. And he ends up with 9,700 on this side and 300 over on this side. Yeah. Yeah. Right. They did whatever seemed normal to them. Yeah. And how God knows, of course, God knows everything. God knows, this will get me down to the level of men that I want joining Gideon in battle. But yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And without any real explanation as to why they chose to do it that way or how common this kind of thing is. I don't think I've ever seen anybody as a natural order of business lap water like a dog, but okay. Yeah, It may have been. God knew exactly who he wanted, and he helped them hear or see what he wanted them to do. Good. Okay, so while this paring down of Israel's army was occurring, Midian was camped below Israel in this valley of Jezreel, as we showed. Now I'm looking at the clock and the notes, and I think we might want to call it for the night. It's actually a fairly short section. Well, yeah, I think we should call it. I don't think we'll get through it. I just don't want to break in the middle of things. So, anyway. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Okay, go ahead. So they're not blocking their eyes when they're drinking, so that they lap like a dog. Then they're hyper aware of their surroundings, so they can go to battle. So valiant men constantly knowing their responsibility as a military commander. I think I've heard that before, but I didn't come across it this time around. So, yeah, it's a good way of thinking about things, possibly. So, all right, yeah, let's save section number 5 for next week. So, thanks everyone for coming. Have a wonderful, blessed evening. Thank you.